Anand, I think the best way to start this conversation, as I always do, is to start with definitions. Let's start with defining consciousness, the self, and the mind.
Okay, so I agree with you that it's good to start with definitions, as long as we also keep in mind that definitions are themselves things that are trying to capture something other than words, like the self, consciousness, the state, not just the word. But it's useful to start with definitions so that we have some rough approximation of what we're trying to get at. So the definitions I'm going to give are going to begin by coming from, in the case of consciousness, Western philosophy. And in the case of the self and the mind, I will note when I'm talking about something in relationship to Indian philosophy or non-Western philosophy and the notion of mind in both of those traditions. Okay. So probably the most important definition of consciousness to put on the table when you begin a conversation is the definition of what's known as phenomenal consciousness, which is articulated most carefully through the work of David Chalmers, and was initially brought into relief and perspective by the work of Thomas Nagel. And it is the notion that there is something it's like to have an experience. So if I have an experience, and it has what is called the what it's like feature, then we say that it's a state of phenomenal consciousness. So what it's like to undergo seeing red versus blue is different. What it's like to taste marinara sauce versus curry is different. What it's like to hear C minor is different than A minor. These differences are capturing what it's like. There's something it's like that's different in each of those cases. Now, that definition of consciousness can be contrasted with a richer notion, which is also important. It's called affective consciousness. Okay, affective consciousness has to do with consciousness that is phenomenal, but in addition has some sort of affect, which means feeling or emotion related to it. So what we would typically say is that if something pertains to affective consciousness, there is something that has positive or negative valence to it. That means it's not just that it feels like, it's just not that there's a what it's like feature. It's that it feels somewhat like on the pain pleasure scale to go up or down. Okay. Yeah. So that's affective consciousness. And then the third notion that we need to bring on the table is the definition known as for access consciousness. Access, not affect. Access consciousness has to do with the fact that a state or representation is available for use in action, speech, judgment, and inference. So the notion of access consciousness is oftentimes contrasted most clearly with the notion of phenomenal consciousness, because there is a debate, controversy about whether or not you can have access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so the example that is used to motivate this is the case of blind sight patients. So a blind sight patient, for example, does not see out of the left side of their visual field in the sense of having what it's like to see an object on the table. But if you prompt a blind sight patient to pick up something on the table, if you prompt them enough times, then eventually they will probably reliably pick up the object on the table, which leads to the idea that there's something there that guides their action, but there's nothing it's like for them to see that thing, but there's a way in which they can act with relationship to the world. There's a really nice video out there you can show people of a person who's being asked to walk down a hallway where there are a number of ordinary obstacles like tables and chairs and basketballs and whatnot, and they have blind sight and they successfully walk down the hallway, which suggests that something is present there in their mind that is allowing them to do something like a judgment of navigation in this corridor. So blind sight, a very interesting topic just to look at what's going on there. But again, the three definitions we have are phenomenal consciousness. There's a subjective, what it's like aspect to the experience. Oftentimes that's what contrasts with different experiences, the red versus blue case. Then there's affective consciousness. There's some sort of positive or negative valence in the conscious state. And then there's access consciousness. Okay, now one last important point to make about all three of these is that the relationship between these is something that people debate now today in philosophy. They all are being debated. So one of the debates that people will have is, like I pointed out, can you have access consciousness without any phenomenal consciousness? Another one people will debate is whether or not you can have phenomenal consciousness without affective consciousness. Can it be the case that there's something it's like to be in a specific state, but there's nothing positive or negative about what it's like to be in that state, right? So it's important to recognize that these are terms we use in philosophy and cognitive neuroscience to think about consciousness, but they're controversial. They have relations between them, and they have very important relationships to other ideas that we might want to discuss. So one thing I think that's relevant to bring up here is, what is the definition of sentience, right? So sentience fits in the family of terms people oftentimes associate in talking about consciousness. And I think the common notion of sentience is a combination of two other more basic things. So the two basic things that come together are phenomenal and affective consciousness. Or you could say even just affective consciousness, because affective consciousness implies phenomenal consciousness. If it feels a certain way, there's something it's like to undergo it. And sentience is more clearly associated with affective consciousness. But because there are these other notions of consciousness, I prefer usually to talk not about sentience, but about a certain type of consciousness, one of the three we've mentioned. Okay, now one more distinction to come out that's relevant here is that these definitions are the common ones in Western philosophy that are being debated now.
Yeah.
If you look at classical Indian philosophy, though, the distinction that shows up most often in the literature is a distinction between what is pure consciousness and, I guess for lack of a better term, impure consciousness. And this has to do with the distinction relating to what kind of structure the conscious state has. So an ordinary experience in the world has what's known as a subject-object structure. There's the person who's experiencing it, and there's experience the person has, and they're the objects of experience. It's that I see this computer. It's that I see you through the computer. It's that I hear this specific sound. Those are the objects of experience that I'm the subject of experience. So impure consciousness in Indian philosophy is the notion of subject-object consciousness. It's a consciousness that relates to a subject to an object. It can also be known as intentional consciousness, the fact that your mind is directed at something. Pure consciousness, by contrast, has no subject-object structure. It lacks a subject-object structure. And again, like in the Western case, it is also controversial. So just as someone can debate whether or not there is really access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness, someone can really debate whether or not pure consciousness even makes sense, given that the ordinary understanding of conscious states is that they have a subject-object structure. Okay, so that'll cover, I think, the initial definitions of what we mean by consciousness that we have to have on the table.
Yes.
And then what we can do is talk about the self, and we can talk about mind. So let's start with mind first, since we're going in this kind of order of consciousness, mind, and then we're going down to something like self. In Western philosophy, it's very common to think that Franz Brentano made a very important and landmark contribution to talking about the mind, because he had this idea that intentionality, this aspect in which we can be directed at something, is sort of the mark of the mental, right? So there's this notion, mental, mind, and one of the core ideas that captures it is that mentality exhibits intentionality, that your mind is the type of thing that can be directed or about something. When you're having a perceptual experience or you're listening to someone, your mind is directed at the object of the experience or what the person is saying to you. In both of those cases, this key feature that seems to be really important about mindedness is that it has intentionality. Now, in some traditions of philosophy, it is the case that when we think about mentality, we think about it as part of nature. And in other traditions, we think of it as the one thing that seems to be the hardest thing in nature to explain. Okay? So one common thing in Indian philosophy, in the Sankhya tradition, for example, is to talk about this notion of the mind as being something that is part of nature, what is known as prakriti. And to talk about states of consciousness, like pure consciousness, as the thing that's outside of nature. And in Western philosophy, because there's a relationship between intentional consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, there's a tendency to think that intentionality and phenomenal consciousness are these two things that are hard to explain in nature, right? Okay, so that's a little bit about the notion of mind and mentality. One of the things that I'm trying to push for clarification here is that you should not assume in a cross-traditional dialogue that the notion of mind and mentality means the same thing as consciousness.
Yes.
Because in some traditions, what is being picked out by consciousness has a different function and is more specific in a very salient and important way. Okay, so final one, the self. Okay, this one, I believe someone at one point in time pointed out to me that we can find at least 17 different notions of the self. So we're not going to go through all of them. I don't even think I know all of them, but I used to teach classes on it, and I'd go through a couple. So I think we'll go through some of the core ideas. I think actually maybe it's better to think of it not just core ideas, but ways of conceptualizing self-talk, talk of the self, right? So this is like conceptions, not definitions. It's just like ways of thinking about what's going on. I think one of the ways to start is that the self is sometimes thought of as this thing that's like the agent or principal controller of the body. Like somehow it is either distinct from the physical body or it is a subcomponent of the rest of the body, but it's not the whole body. Okay, and it has certain properties. It has the property to control the body, to be the actor, acting and making decisions. It has a will or voluntas, and it is somehow what is responsible for agency in the body and through the body. Okay, and so that is a conception that is oftentimes discussed. Now, for some people, that is a very strange notion because they don't think that there's some actor controlling their body, or they don't think that there's anything smaller than their body that is the self. So for some people, talking about the self just is talking about what's called the person. Okay, so we don't want to say that persons and selves in the beginning are the same thing. And there's a relationship here where we can now talk about self and person. Okay, so that's one notion of the self. Sorry, one conception of the self that sort of is clearly out there in a lot of different areas. So two other ones that show up are what's known as the narrative conception of the self, which is the idea that whatever is the self, there is nothing to it other than it's a series of narrations of a life story. It's a very popular notion, both with a lot of students I teach and younger generations of people, but also it's found in psychology and other areas of research and therapy. So there is this idea that the self is like a constructed story, all of which is not explicit at any one time to a person who has a narrative self, but can be made explicit, can be adjusted, changes over time, and plays a role in certain psychological states. Like, so if the narrative conception of the self can help explain why, for example, someone might be feeling depressed from a certain point of view, or why they might be feeling elated, because the story they have of their self is something that gives an explanatory credence or is able to explain why they're having certain kinds of psychological states. So there's a lot of work on narrative conceptions of the self. They're very interesting. But this can be contrasted with the authorial sense of the self, which is okay, if the self is a story, and a story is a creation and an act of assembly, then there's something there that's doing that, right? Otherwise, you're telling me there's a story without an author, but there is no sense of making sense. We can't make sense of the notion of a story without an author. So the authorial self is sometimes seen to be related to the actor controller, principal controller self, but it need not be. And the reason why is because you can say that certain things are true of the authorial self that make it less robust than the actor principal self, right? So you can say, for example, the authorial self is really subject to a lot of inherent problems that occur in the body that affect what it's able to do. So, for example, bias is one thing that happens that can show up with the authorial self. Like you're inclined as an authorial self to tell a certain kind of story about yourself, right? As opposed to another one. Notions of the actor and the principal self oftentimes try to say that this is the seat of this is the thing that is pure, this is the thing that has power and control and can do all these things and makes decisions. But authorial notions of the self are more just trying to make sense of how narration could be a coherent idea by focusing on the fact that there's an author. And there's no commitment to the claim in the authorial self that like it's not the whole body or it's like some subcomponent or those things are not as relevant as explaining the conceptual coherence of narrative conceptions against the background of something that would be responsible for the narration, right? That's kind of what we get there. Okay, so one last one that's also relevant is the idea of the true self. This shows up a lot in Indian philosophy under the term Atman. And so the true self is supposed to be more closely associated with the principal actor control notion of the self. But again, it's important to recognize that here, when we're talking, we must pay attention to the role of whether or not free will is possible or not in thinking about this self. So there can be a true self in an Indian tradition for which there is no freedom. That would be completely inconsistent with the idea of the actor principal self that's present in other traditions where this is what's being explained is the true seat of free will, right? So that's I'm sort of avoiding giving a lot of names of people who said such things because that'll just bog us down, but I'm distinguishing conceptually the space of what is relevant here. So I just want to make that clear. Like you will find in Indian traditions one sort of notion of the true self, and you wouldn't, for example, say that that's the same notion you find in Immanuel Kant when he talks about the transcendental self or the noumenal self or something like that. So the names are not important. The conceptual distinction is really what's important. What's relevant here is the role that freedom plays as a property of the thing that's said to be a self, right? And this also can pertain to whether or not it's material or immaterial, right? So it could be a notion of a material true self that lacks freedom, a material actor self that has freedom, an immaterial actor self, which is the only way to explain freedom, or an immaterial true self that's housed in a material body, but is ultimately identical to pure consciousness, which is the advice. Okay. Yeah, so those are our terms. You go now.
So look, there's a lot to unpack there, and I think it's they're all fascinating in their own right. Each perspective. You mentioned this subject-object distinction and how in both Indian philosophy and Western philosophy these are perceived very differently. I think let's unpack that a little, because the fact that we have thousands of years worth of the mind-body problem within Western philosophy and how it's interpreted and how we apply any sort of initiative moving forward, trying to understand consciousness, is dependent on the fact that we only use this sort of paradigm to understand this. But there's also thousands of years of Eastern philosophy and Indian philosophy that has so much to say and is perhaps not, if it is brought into the conversation, maybe it's not the right people bringing it in, because you have an influx of people who claim to understand Indian philosophy today via Western perspectives. And I don't think they're particularly do it justice. Because growing up as a child, I mean, I'm Indian, and as an Indian from South Africa, I have my own perception of what it is to understand Indian culture, and it's very different from my ancient ancestors in India. So I can imagine the blurry lines that take place when people try to interpret Indian philosophy already. With that, so there's a lot that I said there, but with that being said, what is your take on the differences between Western philosophy of mind and Indian philosophy of mind? And how are these two fields coming together or providing insight of the lack of, let's say, definitive answers within each field?
Okay, good question. So first thing is that I think there's no error in this question whatsoever. I just want to make that clear. But this question requires careful qualification in the following sense. There is nothing that we can say is the Western tradition, and there is nothing we can say is the Indian tradition, because there has been global interaction for thousands of years. So, so what we really mean when we say something like this are relative to certain pockets within each of these geographical regions. As time goes forward, there seems to be currents and discussions, and then across time also, that line up and don't line up. And that precisification is absolutely necessary for making any sense of what we should be asking in this area. For me to grossly generalize across these true, I'll just give you an example. I think someone else mentioned to me something about the role of spirituality in discussions of consciousness in Indian philosophy in contrast to what is done in Western philosophy. And I had to remind them that that's incorrect. There are Indian philosophical traditions that eschew spirituality in their discussions of consciousness altogether. It's a lot easier to pick up specific like items of discussion and see them, again. And also I would say that this holds more generally for, Chinese philosophy, Arabic philosophy, Maori philosophy, and lots of other cultures. So if you go too far down this thing, then you end up saying, I'm only talking about this guy in this time period relative to this guy in this time period, or this woman in this time period against that guy in that time period. And it starts to become just impossible to generalize at all. So I don't think you have to go that far. But if I don't qualify in some ways, it would be bad. So now the qualification has been made. Let me just try and give you some current things that are relevant. So I think right now, maybe I'll do it backwards. I'll start now with what's going on now. Right now, there seems to be a lot of interest in contemporary debates about the nature of consciousness, where the ideas that are being discussed seem like they could clearly be advanced, interrogated, supplemented, discussed in more detail by the intersection of a period of Indian philosophy from the 2nd century to the 17th century, at least, if not also from the middle part of the 20th century. I myself have contributed to work in this area. And in fact, earlier today, I was talking with my friends who I'm now working with, and we're having a 3-year research project on exactly how to do this with respect to one tradition in Indian philosophy and contemporary work in analytic philosophy. So I definitely think the timing is right. So one kind of coarse-grained way to say it is that two groups of people who for a long time, at least 100 years, started to move away from each other and stop talking to each other have now decided that it might be time to talk to each other. And these are the people that work in philosophy of religion and the people that work in the philosophy of mind. Those people have decided now that they want to start talking to each other. And given that in classical Indian philosophy, specifically in the Vedanta tradition, there is always a discussion of these two elements together, it's natural to think that there is a way to engage in that conversation. So that's kind of where like some of the cutting edge stuff is going on. It's sort of sometimes called the debate or the relationship between panpsychism and panentheism. That's some technical way of talking about it. But it need not be, you don't need these fancy terms. You just need this idea that like something about religious doctrines in which God is discussed is now going to be framed in conversation with what's going on in consciousness studies. So that's kind of like the frame of like the cutting edge. I would say like there was a recent conference actually in upstate New York specifically discussing this. I'm part of a 3-year John Templeton grant discussing Vaishnavite conceptions of God and consciousness and analytic philosophy for the next 3 years. There already was several anthologies that came out on this topic in this journal Sophia, and other people are now working on this. And there are a lot of ways it can unravel once you bring artificial intelligence into the conversation as well, which I'll get to later. But let's stay focused more first on this a general theme. Okay, so the classic distinction, pretty much, I think most teachers of comparative philosophy would like to say, is that there's a vertical versus a horizontal problem. This is a gross generalization, but for the purposes now that we've qualified, we can say this. The vertical problem is the mind-body problem as it's understood between Descartes, for example, and Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia in her correspondences with him, where she challenges him on certain his ideas about mental causation, right? So basically, he ends up giving a dualist picture in which the mind is a completely different kind of substance, articulated by the idea of pure thought, and it's different from res extensia, which are material bodies in the world that can be divided infinitely. And she wonders then, well, how can the mind, the principal actor who chooses to move the body, if they're two different kinds of substances and causation is restricted to substances that are of the same kind, right? If only material bodies can causally interact with other material bodies, how can something non-material interact with the material body, right? So Princess Elizabeth points this out, and this becomes sort of the vertical problem of that is the mind-body problem emanating forward from. And also, we should make it clear, I'm not going to be talking about any mind-body problem in Western philosophy before what happens through Descartes forward, because that's just going to complicate things even more. We're just talking about the standard. That's the most common notion that people are talking about in the West. This is a rough characterization of it that people can understand. And so for reasons that have to relate to causation, people then adopt certain theories in that space, such as materialism, because it allows us to solve this problem of mental causation. That's what's going on. In Indian philosophy, it's not clear that frame is functioning that way. What seems clear in other traditions, like Sankhya and probably Vedanta too, is more what's sometimes referred to as a horizontal problem, which is so if you want to put it nicely, what is the relationship between Purusha in Sankhya and Prakriti, which is pure consciousness and the nature? What's the relationship between the two? So this is a theory where something like the ideas of the mind-body problem in Western philosophy can be grafted onto the other side, and you can start to see maybe how to understand it that way. But the trajectory of what's happening in the literature just doesn't go that way. And so that would be a way of answering your question by saying, with respect to a certain frame of Indian philosophy, you can find a difference when people are talking about something called the mind-body problem. But again, I just want to note this. If you think that there are no materialist schools of mind in Indian philosophy, you would be horribly mistaken. The Charvaka school basically has one of the strongest forms of materialism I've ever taught in my life. It's an extremely strong form of materialism, and they are definitely people who are debating various Hindu schools, Buddhist schools, and Jain schools. So it's very hard to take them out of the sort of view of what are the schools that are found in the geographic area called India now back then. So it's very clear that like you're not going to get out of this thing by saying that there's this general thing that's going on in India that's not going on over here. The materialism that they advocate can be brought into conversation with various ancient thinkers in Greece, as well as modern thinkers in the 20th century. So I can give names to that, but so that's the thing. So, but there is that general contrast of what is the relationship between this pure type of consciousness and the mind. And remember, because of what I said, now we have some tools to understand the difference here. In this system of Samkhya, the operations of the mind concerning intentionality, functioning, reasoning, judging, and all that are already part of nature, right? It was in the sort of Brentano sort of thing where intentionality and phenomenal consciousness are related in a way, or can be related to one another, that we have this problem of well, how is the mind directed at things? Yeah, exactly. I mean, one way you could think about this also that makes it sort of relevant is, I want to make sure I get this right. I don't know if I will because it's been a while since I taught this particular thing, but intentionality is something that can direct you at something that doesn't exist, right? Mm-hmm. So suppose I am searching for Atlantis, and let's assume that Atlantis actually doesn't exist. So then my mind is directed at something that doesn't exist, right? Yet the best explanation for my behavior in terms of my beliefs, desire, life project planning in order to be the one who finds this place first are only explained by a non-existent object. Well, that seems to be a very hard thing for a materialist theory to explain. That seems to be the most fundamental feature of what can happen to us. We are oftentimes motivated and directed by non-existent objects, right? Sure, we're also motivated by existent objects, but if the mind has this feature that it can do that, to some people, honestly, that question is what gets them into philosophy of mind. That's actually the one in Western philosophy. A lot of people are like, wait a minute, that does sound like a really powerful explanation. This person spent their life doing something, and the best explanation for it is that there was this thing their mind was directed at. It was a false belief, but still the only explanation, that thing that doesn't exist, was explaining why they did all these other things, right? So that thing that doesn't exist has to be the explanatory factor. And that makes people think, well, the mind has this capacity for intentionality. And oftentimes intentionality comes along with phenomenal consciousness, or something it's like to desire to find Atlantis, right? There's something related to that. It's affective in some ways. But that thing, that thing. But in that question of intentionally directed consciousness towards non-existent objects is not like a very common, it's not actually a very big theme in Indian philosophy of mind. You don't see a lot of people discussing that. I'm not going to say it's not there, because every time someone says that, lo and behold, you find it 15 days later. So just do not find yourself. It is not present in a lot of the literature I look at. That's not the going. So sometimes people like to say this. This will help you to have a lot. They like to say that the concerns and motivations for doing philosophy of mind are driven by different explanatory aims, right? The explanatory aim isn't to show how the mind can be directed at non-existent objects. The primary explanatory aim is to show the relationship between the individual self and God, right? And that is tied into their philosophy of mind and philosophy of consciousness. And that is something that a lot of people now who are working on consciousness in the West are returning to as a question to which Indian philosophy already had a lot to say. So now let's explain the Western side of this so you can see a little bit more of what's going on and how they connect. So two of the most common views out there right now about consciousness in Western analytic philosophy that are being debated, and I know people on both of these sides, there's a lot of views, by the way. I'm just focusing on two. I can go through a list of longer ones, but two of them are panpsychism and illusionism. All right. So the fundamental thesis, the central thesis, like the thesis of illusionism, is that our phenomenal consciousness, properties of what it's like to feel things, see things, are all illusions. Doesn't mean we don't have them in a sense, but it does mean in a sense they're just illusions. Just as like when you see a snake superimposed on a rope, there's no snake there, right? There's just a rope, right? So if you're saying that the illusions in our experience are phenomenal properties or phenomenal consciousness illusion, you are in some sense coming close to talking that way. You're saying they're not really there in some sense, right? But they're they have this intermediate existence or something like that. So this is a version that is consistent with certain kinds of materialism about the mind, but it's being novel in the way in which it's trying to tease out what's going on. So one of the ways in which this is oftentimes explained as being an interesting thing is it kind of shifts our attention to explaining phenomenal consciousness to explaining why we have such an illusion.
Yeah.
Why would evolution have generated in us this illusion? What role does this illusion play in our existence? Okay. So it's not based primarily on, so other forms of materialism are motivated by this stuff about causation. But this is not motivated by causation. This is motivated more by the fact that if we alter our way of thinking of things and think about it as an illusion, we can start to wonder why this illusion was generated or what's going on with this illusion. So that sits in contrast with another view.
Anand, sorry to stop you there, but someone who's really trying to work on that a lot lately, I noticed, is Nicholas Humphrey. I'm not sure if you've seen his
I know who he is.
Yeah, so he's been trying to actually figure that concept out now, the evolution of it, the function of it. Why is this illusion occurring? Sorry, sorry.
Yeah, so Nicholas Humphreys has a book called Soul Dust, I believe. I think that's what it's called. And I speak most frequently with Keith Frankish, who is pretty much the person who has pioneered that term in the field. He also works a lot on this. But actually, in my last conversation with Keith Frankish in Crete just a couple of months ago, he actually told me that I should start reading Nicholas Humphrey's work more and more because it has an interestingly different way of explaining a lot of these things. So you're right. It is cutting edge stuff. I think that book isn't that recent, but you're right. Nicholas Humphreys is one of the people.
He's written a new book now called Sentience, and he tries to work on that a lot more. So he's done a lot of different things recently.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That right. So I think, and also it is. I can already anticipate probably why it's called Sentience, because illusionists have this issue when it comes to the moral grounding problem, which we'll get to later. And I understand that I'll probably have very different views than Nicholas Humphrey on this, but so we'll get to that. So the contrast is the panpsychist view, and the motivation for panpsychism. I mean, I'm giving very rough and accessible explanations. These aren't the technical details, but I've always liked this thought that I find in the work of Galen Strawson, where the idea is that you want to explain phenomenal consciousness, but it seems like unless you say that at the fundamental level, the universe has some things that have bits of consciousness, micropsychism as it's called, you would have to say that something emerges from something and there is no way to conceive of how it emerges. So the analogy I use to teach this, which I believe he discusses too, is that you can't really conceive how to get a real line in the world from non-extended Cartesian points. This is not going to happen because the relationship between extension and non-extension is not such that some form of complexity and aggregation is conceivably going to give you that thing. And so he tries to say, in some sense, or at least when I teach it, I do it this way. I say, well, phenomenal consciousness, that what it's like feature seems to exhibit a similar thing. No amount of aggregation of non-phenomenal kinds of things appears to, in complexity way or whatever, get you this thing, phenomenal consciousness. So why not say that at least some points, some things at the fundamental level are already conscious, and then this leads to a big, area. So now then this is how we can see things. So this view, the micropsychist view, takes one kind of stance, and then for reasons that I can get into if you want to, there's another view called cosmopsychism, which says, why assume that it's individual bits like molecules and protons or whatever that have this phenomenal consciousness at a microscopic micro level? Why not assume that the universe as a whole is consciousness, and that's the fundamental thing? And then there's cosmopsychism and panpsychism.
Yeah, and that's Philip Goff sort of takes it. Philip Goff starts to work on that from that direction.
Yeah, so right. So those are the two general, but look, by the way, in between, at least in the panpsychism camp, there's a bunch of different views of how to work this out. So even in analytic philosophy, let alone Indian philosophy. The illusionism one is a little bit more straightforward, although I would say that my impression is that Daniel Dennett, Nicholas Humphreys, Keith Frankish, and Jay Garfield have subtly different ways of articulating what the illusion is. So I've worked heavily with Jay Garfield, and I've written and talked a little bit with Keith Frankish about their different versions, or what I perceive to be different versions. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way in which you talk about the nature of the illusion. So I tend to have a very strong impression that the core notion of an illusion is visual. And because of that, when I try to make the analogy with what is illusory in the case of phenomenal consciousness, I get confused right away, to which they tell me that's because you're focusing on the illusion being
visual.
A visual, and then they say, but it's really a cognitive illusion, to which then we debate, and I say, the notion of this cognitive illusion doesn't really do service to what you're trying to say, because if it's a cognitive illusion of this kind, I could just stop having that belief, because beliefs are a little bit more subject to control than the illusions we have in the Mueller liar case. Like in the Mueller liar case, there's nothing really you're going to do to get rid of it. It's just going to happen. You're hardwired that way. So if they're trying to say we're hardwired to have this belief illusion, false belief, it seems a little bit less believable to me that people just can't get rid of that. Yeah. So I think that, but this is an ongoing debate. Like I talk to them about all this all the time, and I'm like, I'm not sure I get it. But then in the panpsychist camp, there are two well-known problems that motivate the discussion, which is exactly how Indian philosophy came to be more relevant, is because once people started looking at these issues of micropsychism, where there are small atom-like micro-conscious entities, and cosmopsychism, where there's one gigantic field of consciousness, there became the twin problems of combination and decombination, which is if there are micro-conscious entities, I need to explain how I get your Tev unified conscious states. And if there is a cosmic consciousness, then I need to figure out how does the cosmic consciousness reduce or decombine so that there's Tev consciousness and my consciousness, right? And again, given that our consciousness are different, we have to explain that difference too, right? So once this happened in contemporary analytic philosophy, myself and a couple of other Indian philosophers started really sort of like working trying to make the case that you needed to pay attention to this. And we published a volume of the Monist Journal dedicated to discussing this. And now there's much more work being done. And that's sort of how the pantheism stuff got off the ground. But you will notice that in all of these debates Indian philosophers are talking about, if I was to say to them, like, hey, let's talk about this because we're interested in phenomenal consciousness, they'd be like, that's really not my motivation. I'm not sure I'm really that concerned with explaining. If that ends up being a side effect of what I'm talking about, then hey, go have fun with that. Their primary motivation had to be the relationship to God. I mean, that's clearly what's being done in the debates between Ramanuja, who came after Shankara in the Vishishta Advaita Vedanta school, and his debates with Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. They clearly are concerned with the relationship and intelligibility of the individual self to God on a picture where something like a field of universal consciousness is present, but they're not really, sitting there wondering how to explain whether and how you have a C-sharp experience versus an F-sharp experience. I mean, that just wasn't their... So that's, again, another way to see this sort of thing where it's like there are different streams of what is motivating these people to talk about these things. I'm not always so sure it's good to say that they don't have any, like if you told one of those people, hey, there's this problem we're working on, we could go back in time and ask them. Like I said, I'm not sure they wouldn't become interested and want to say what they would think. But if I said, this is the reason to be talking about it, I think they would laugh at me. They would think this is crazy. This is not why we're doing it. Yeah. So you get it.
It's almost like, just another way to reiterate what you're trying to say is like with idealist philosophy, it's almost like a Berkeley's version of trying to understand it to prove God's existence, whereas today's idealist philosophers they have absolutely no interest in that. They're very much almost atheist towards the topic, but still trying to ground that framework. Is that what you're trying to say? Is that, it was very
okay. I wasn't trying to say that a moment ago, but that characterization is absolutely correct. In fact, that characterization is exactly the characterization that led to this grant that I'm part of on John Templeton Foundation on Vaishnavite conceptions of God and cosmopsychism. That's exactly what we argued. What the producers, they argued that basically there is a tendency in contemporary versions of cosmopsychism to sort of tacitly assume that a form of atheism is true or that it's consistent with these cosmopsychist explanations. But yet in the vast amounts of Vedantic philosophy that discusses cosmopsychism, it would be bad to assume that was even at play. It's more like, what is the relationship between those? So, that could be, so like, let's make it clear. That doesn't make it a good position. It makes it just the relevant distinction. So it could turn out to be the case that trying to say that a theistic discussion of cosmopsychism is better than an atheistic discussion, it just turns out to be really bad and lead to bad consequences. But is it true that there is that difference? yeah, I would find it hard to believe that the evidence showed that the Indian philosophers in some way were tacitly advocating something other than the relationship between God and the individual self. So I think that's relevant.
I think.
And also,
sorry, continue.
no, you continue.
I was chatting to Noam Chomsky about this, and the fact that Indian philosophy, I mean, the Sanskrit in general, I mean, that language is so complex. It was able to transmit so much knowledge. With the amount of punctuations, the vocabulary, it was so rich and diverse. So it was able to transmit a lot of information. However, it was so ingrained into religious and spiritual teachings, and that's why a lot of Western culture was unable to sort of sift through that information. It's almost like reading St. Augustine's work, and it's so ingrained in the religion that you don't have to necessarily take that out of it. There's still so much teaching behind it, and we're blinded by the religious aspect of it because of that. Do you think that's a big problem that sort of hinders us from understanding it even deeper?
Okay, so I think, yeah, I definitely have an insight into what you're saying. I'll frame it a little bit differently, but I think it is on this theme. So one of the things that is happening in January is my friend Swami Medananda and I are hosting a 2-day conference in Calcutta on the reemergence of spirituality and philosophy. And sort of part of the reason we want to do this is because we're interested in drawing out this connection that had occurred. So again, it's occurred in Western philosophy before. Obviously, you mentioned Augustine. But there was a time period, at least for 100 years, where it seems like these things are separated out. And a lot of it had to do with the growth of science and the philosophy of science and what those people were concerned with. So that's kind of like what's happened. And I'm kind of working on putting those conversations back together. So that's an answer to part of the question, but you also focus on the hindering it, right? Is it hindering our ability to make progress by not discussing these spiritual aspects that people have before discussed and it was ingrained in them? So I do have something to say about this. And I did write a paper where I discussed this a while back, not in this way, but I'll give you that answer. I don't see a problem with trying it out. I mean, it seems really odd to me that all these people back then did talk about it this way. And then somehow we got the arrogance to think they were just confused. And now we can't even bother to try to think about it critically with some really smart people that we have and see what progress we can get. I find that to be an instance of not being epistemically humble. I think that is it's a cautionary moment that we would not think we ought to be like sort of like, why wouldn't we try this out? So that was the view I had in 2015 when I started thinking about it. I was like, yeah, I mean, it's not just an issue of what is the probability of what theory will turn out to be true. It's the risk of not taking a road that could have insights either that suggests that theories in that area are correct, or that informs the very progress, and this is the hindering point you made, of the development of the theories that we're on. So yeah, it's I think it's worth giving it a try, and I think the people right now who are sort of working on this stuff, even in more detail than I am, are giving it a good try, and let's see where it goes. I think one thing you have to realize here is that it's problematic because religion oftentimes, it always involves things that are sacred and sort of control the trajectory of someone's life. And the minute you start trying to argue, debate whether these things are true or not, you can really get some people upset in a way. I personally think that's how it should go, but it would be naive to be insensitive to the way in which these debates can go down.
I think the same. I think that also happens with illusionism in a sense, because consciousness is also so sacred to a lot of people, and trying to argue against it. Keith and them, and Keith when we spoke about it. He told me, I mean, it's almost like he's attacking people's faith at this point.
Yeah, he told me that too. He said actually that's why sometimes looking at Nicholas Humphrey's work, especially when he uses the label surrealism, it can help people see the beauty and the magic of illusionism. So yes, that is correct. You're right, because people do feel, but I got to say, like, I mean, it's you know, there are these views that pain is an illusion. I mean, this is just like one of those things where I'm just like, yeah, okay, that's not really comforting to tell someone who's in pain. Okay, I'm not really sure what you're getting out of that, but okay, yeah, you get the joke. There's a joke somewhere in there, even for Keith, I think, that he can understand.
Someone who tries to avoid that is Michael Graziano. When he tries to approach, he just calls it a caricature rather than an illusion. It's just slightly different, but it is there. It's definitely something occurring.
It is, but see, again, now, Tev, you're pointing to some very important things that I actually think can help make sense of it. Like, I do think the conception of it as surrealism versus the conception of it as illusionism, close to like a visual illusionism, versus a subset of beliefs or a caricature or a system or a way of thinking that allows the organism to function properly in various environments. I think all of those things, that's a small part of the theory, by the way, are very crucial to understanding like what is really being said and how people can accept it. But I will say this, like, none of my personal reasons for rejecting illusionism have to do with those specific things. I actually literally think that my main arguments that I've been working on have to do with disanalogies with visual illusion and the fact that there seems to be an undermining component to all of the other forms of knowledge that we have. So my last conversation with Keith and other people was to work out a way in which, if illusionism is true, it's going to turn out that a lot of knowledge that we have goes away. And that way in which it goes away is very different from the way in which standard skepticism is argued for example, in the work of René Descartes. So illusionism generates, in my view, a destruction of even the knowledge under which we would know illusionism to be true. So Keith thinks this is very confused and controversial. He does not agree with me about this argument at all, and he has very good responses to what I'm saying, at least in conversation. But part of what I've been working on for 5 years is the idea that illusionist theories of consciousness undermine the capacity for all types of phenomenal knowledge based on phenomenal experience. And I have some pretty well worked out arguments about how that goes. That leaves us with other forms of knowledge, but for a lot of people, it's going to be really depressing if this result holds. And I think it's so my reasons for rejecting it aren't about, this personal thing. It's about, I think we do have knowledge, and I think the knowledge that we have is fundamental to the human condition. And I think that those things seem to be inconsistent with various ways of expressing illusionism, right? Yeah.
Let's go into those arguments against it, and perhaps maybe to frame it. I mean, your view, how would you label it at this point? From a philosophical perspective, what would you call it, and how would you approach defending it?
Well, I think
closing it off a little.
No, you're right. I can give you the arguments and basically the structure of how they work, but those arguments don't constitute the positive view I have about consciousness, which we should talk about later when we get to the other issues, because it's more of a view about the moral grounding problem in relationship to consciousness than it is a theory of consciousness. Like that it's going to, I don't have some thing that's going to compete with global workspace theory or integrated information theory. That's not, I don't work on that at that level. That's way above my pay grade, buddy. Way above my pay grade. I'm mostly reading those people's work. But there is an argument here, because I train mostly as an epistemologist working at the intersection of philosophy of mind, that I'm concerned with. And that argument is that when you take your phenomenal experience to be an illusion, you cannot point to your phenomenal experience to justify any of your beliefs. So let's take, maybe, like, it's not the most common, but it's a very commonly discussed knowledge here, rough picture of what knowledge is. When you know something, it's because you believe it, it turns out to be true, and you have the capacity to justify it in a certain way. And what is that capacity? One, if someone challenged your belief, you could argue in favor of it, okay? Now, there are lots of problems with this justified true belief theory of knowledge that have been known for over 100 years, but at least it can give us a picture where we can focus on what illusionism might have as a problem in relationship to it. Illusionism is telling me that my phenomenal experience is an illusion, which means that in some sense, it's false. It's either all globally false or some components of it are false, right? Which means that when I point to my phenomenal experience and say, oh, it's because I felt that, it's because I saw that. When I point to my phenomenal experience, the phenomenality of it can't do any work. It has to, because it's false, right? So the argument is basically, it's a lot more elaborate, but the outline of it is that when you want to appeal to something to justify something, you cannot appeal to something that you believe to be false. So if I believe this not to be a cup right here, it's only my cup right here. If I believe this is not a cup, and then someone asks me, why is the chair further away from the cup? I cannot point to the cup and say it's because the cup is here and the chair is there, because I don't believe there's a cup there, okay? So if you believe in illusionism, you believe that your phenomenal experience is an illusion, which means at some level, all of it is false, or some component of it is false, but you don't know which one component is false. And then you want to point to your phenomenal experience to give you a justification for believing something. That seems to me like that's not going to work, right? And in addition, it's interesting because this kind of argument would show that there is a way to be a skeptic about knowledge of the external world that has nothing to do with the fact that you can't figure out whether or not you're dreaming, you're in the matrix, you're a brain in the vat. All it has to do is with the claim that your phenomenal experience is an illusion, right? The mere fact that you now believe that proposition, my phenomenal experience is an illusion, you're unable to justify beliefs on the basis of appeal to your phenomenal experience. Now, there are some very technical distinctions I use to make this argument work. One is called weak no-false lemmas, and another one is called the basing relation, which help to make this more clear. But in general, the argument basically works in that way, and it has an interesting result. It means that any evidence in favor of illusionism that's based on scientific reasoning, which includes both induction and observation, will have the problem that none of the observations that are appealed to because you believe in your phenomenal illusion can be appealed to, which means that it undermines itself. So that's a side result. That's a result that says this argument will show that if you believe in illusionism, you're forced to have no justification for that belief, right? That's kind of what I'm going for. The paper is currently being looked at by several people, but those are just the rough idea of what I want to say. But now I want to clarify something, which I've discussed with some people. This means only that a certain type of knowledge goes away, okay? Because there are other ways of knowing that are well recognized in epistemology, such as ways that have to do not with pointing to my phenomenal experience, by having a part of my mind that reliably functions in certain environments in the production of cognitive states, okay? It's called process reliabilism. So this theory is just saying that something that we do a lot of, engage in arguing with one another by justifying things through our phenomenal experience, turns out to not work according to this view. And the only thing that works is this other sort of I'm a machine of a certain kind, like a thermometer, and as long as my thermometer brain is working in the right environment, I'm going to get these beliefs that come out that turn out to be okay, which I'm not denying is a way of knowing, but I'm saying it's the other one that goes away that's a bit drastic. And so that's kind of that would be, so this is not a positive argument in terms of another theory. I'm not saying that this favors panpsychism, because I also think panpsychism and cosmopsychism suffer from problems as well. But I think that this shows that it reveals that my interest in illusionism isn't this kind of oh, this couldn't be wrong because it just doesn't make sense of, it hurts it hurts. No, it's just that I think we have knowledge. Yeah, I'm basically an anti-skeptic, and I always have been in philosophy. I think once we start encroaching on the way in which we don't have knowledge to various degrees, I think we start to lose sense of the human condition as opposed to other creatures and systems. So yeah, so that's kind of where I would
in a way, I mean, that perspective is almost similar to an eliminativism. Where I mean, arguing against it is because with that, you're almost breaking down the current knowledge that we have, and you're kind of showcasing the fact that, okay, if you keep doing this, there's a point in grounding a lot of your statements at that point. You at some point you do have an issue with grounding anything you do. There's almost a relativism to everything. Is that sort of a summary?
No, the first part you said, I think, is a very good description. Okay. Like, you're taking the rug out from which you're standing upon.
Yeah.
And actually, just to be clear, nothing I'm saying comes from me. These are well understood points in the history of phenomenology and in many other disciplines. Like, this point I'm making is just to reiterate a well-known move in philosophy, that certain kinds of things that we believe or know depend on the reality of other things. And because of that, if you start to push on that, then it doesn't lead to a relativism. It leads to the absence of anything in some sense. There's no real things going on anymore. So some people like Jay Garfield are kind of happy with this. They're like, it's illusions all the way down. He's a form of what's known as a structural illusionist as well as a phenomenal illusionist. So I distinguish between 4 types of illusionism, basically. Phenomenal illusionism, phenomenal consciousness illusion. Structural illusionism, that the structure of our conscious experience as being subject-object is an illusion. Foundational illusionism, that there can be illusions all the way down without a bedrock, non-illusory bottom. And accuracy illusionism, the belief that our representational states of our external environment are accurate. And I basically think that all forms of illusionism suffer from some philosophical problem or another. The one I talked about now was the phenomenal illusionism.
Well, okay, so I mean, let's try and move from the negative aspect of it towards your pro theory. What would be the positive outlook?
Okay.
What is your consciousness? If someone had to ask you, what is consciousness? How would you label it philosophically? What would you say?
Okay, I think it's safer to do the one that's more closely related to something I do have to say about. So am I on the fence about panpsychism? Yeah, I think I've told other people that. I'm kind of on the fence on it. Do I think certain forms of materialism might make sense in a way? Not really. I guess I'm still, but it's more like what kind of panpsychism would I go in for? And I do have problems with the theory. I do think there are certain versions of it that's not going to do anything for anybody. So do I think it makes sense to talk about consciousness perhaps being fundamental to the universe? Yeah, I think that could be helpful. But does it really lead to these decombination problems in a way where I would be sleeping less if we couldn't solve them? I'm not sure. So let's go to the thing that's connected to this that people want to talk about that's very accessible. And I think it's probably what Nicholas Humphreys' book is working on, which is we definitely have this idea for quite a while in Western philosophy, and at least it's found in other traditions of Indian philosophy as well, that sentience is the explanatory feature for moral status. So the idea is that not everything has moral standing. And the thing that makes it the case that you have moral standing is that you're sentient. Now, you can have different views of sentience in terms of it being digital or graded. That is, that either you're sentient or not, or there are degrees of it. And these are kind of related to each other because it's 0 and like the degrees of it, but at least it's digital in that it's 0 or on in some degree, but there could be different degrees of sentience. That's the idea. And I definitely think that this sort of theory, and the sort of view is problematic. So I have less to say about what is the view of consciousness that is correct, other than saying that I'm heavily invested in still thinking about whether or not it's a fundamental feature of the universe under some model. But I do have something
At this point,
to say.
You're very much agnostic about the whole concept, it seems. It's, you're not making any bold claims about what it is, but you know what it's possibly not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, it takes a lot of time to work. This is done. Consciousness studies is like a mess in some ways, and it's also a really exciting place in other days. So yeah, my research. Also, I have to make it clear, I didn't start doing philosophy by thinking of the philosophy of mind. It was the last thing I studied in graduate school, actually, and I did not work on it for a long time. My background was mostly in mathematical logic and modal logic in particular. So I don't, that's why I'm a little bit more, I was working on these arguments that say that because we can conceive something, something is possible, and because that thing is possible, materialism about consciousness is false. I was working on just the premise that says conceivability entails possibility, which Descartes himself uses and David Chalmers uses in his first book. But I wasn't really interested in like what the result was. I was like interested in why would you ever think that imagining something in your head is going to lead you to some epistemic data that you should take seriously about the nature of the universe? How did imagination do that? You know, that's a great, if imagination does that, that's amazing. And so we need to figure that out. That seemed to me, so kind of philosophy of mind, but really epistemology. That's like I said. So that's why I'm agnostic about it. But let's go to the positive thing. I'm not agnostic about this. I don't think you need sentience to explain moral standing. And actually, over the last 2 years, I've been giving a lot of talks and working more with more and more people. And I'm pretty much not on the fence at all about the fact that the grounding property is not phenomenal consciousness. So it can't be sentience, because sentience implies phenomenal consciousness. However, there's something called the grading property, which means that if two or more things have different grades of moral standing, one thing having more than another, another thing having more than that, there's a grade of moral standing, there can be properties that mark the grading points on the scale. I am somewhat of the view that phenomenal consciousness, affective consciousness, possession of a self, free will, rationality, long-term planning are all grading properties. So they will mark something. But what I am strongly against in relationship to the most dominant view out there is that sentience is the grounding property, right? So there are two debates right now that are important here. One is the view, now we'll drop the word sentience, as I actually told you, I don't really think it's a useful term. One group thinks that the grounding property is affective consciousness. They think that the type of consciousness that grounds moral status is affective. And this has the common sense notion that we're all familiar with. This is when people say things like, well, anything that can feel pain can suffer, and anything that can suffer has moral standing because it has interest in not suffering. That's the Singer version. It's built out of, Bentham. It's also found to a certain degree in Jainism. Buddhists seem to be concerned with it too. So Buddhists don't actually think there can be phenomenal consciousness without affective consciousness, because they think that the way conscious states arises is always valenced in some way by affect. So they don't take that view even seriously, the distinction. But people like David Chalmers has written in his recent book that phenomenal consciousness is not the same as affective consciousness, but phenomenal consciousness is the grounding property. And so there's that alternative view that you can have phenomenal consciousness. And there are ways to think about this that can make sense. So here's one way to think about it. There are already humans that have a condition called pain asymbologia. And in pain asymbologia, you basically don't feel pain, right? But you have other phenomenally conscious states. They just don't relate to pain and pleasure as much or in the same way. You can say they have moral standing because they have phenomenal consciousness without affective consciousness. Sounds like the right answer to me. So for me, the positive thing that's of importance here is that these are all grading properties. What I find problematic is to say that they are the correct grounding property. And the reason why I think they're not the correct grounding property is because I think there is another property that's more basic, that captures a wider net of things and allows us to make sense of moral status, and that is the idea of intelligence. So I think intelligence is the grounding property. Now, just as we gave 4 to 5 definitions of consciousness, you can give probably 8 to 10 definitions of intelligence. Okay? What I'm primarily focused on is a way of thinking about intelligence that has to do with computational systems, and these can be realized in artificial systems or in natural organisms. They're just computational systems that are goal-directed. There is some reason why they do what they are doing. And in addition, they are tied to preference orderings. Okay, so here's an example that can really help you see what I'm getting at. I don't know that amoeba are phenomenally conscious. I don't know that. But I do know that amoeba prefer to be in certain environments over others, and they will move in the direction of being in those environments over others based on very basic ways of gaining information in their environment and computing direction to navigate. Right? I can't remember the name of the creature, but in graduate school, I wrote a book review of a book by Murray Clark, where he used to talk about these sea creatures. They're not amoeba, but what would happen is that they would detect polar north through some sort of magnetic system that they had. And the reason why they did it is because polar north correlated with oxygen-rich water. And so they would always want to go towards that. That's a perfect example of a system that's computational and intelligent, and for which the organism has preferences that are goal-directed. The system is goal-directed in a way that's related to the preferences it needs satisfied in order for it to continue to survive.
That could be like a pan-proto-psychism in a sense.
Don't go get to pan-proto-psychism. Let's not. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I don't want to confuse it with what's going on with just this view, right? Mm-hmm. So this view is trying to say that this kind of computational intelligence which is goal-directed and tied to preferences, is a better ground for moral standing. Because even if this creature isn't phenomenally conscious, it seems like things go better or worse off for it, yes, depending on what water environment it's in. So why do we need phenomenal consciousness? What does the thing have to be phenomenally conscious for it to have moral standing? For the life of me, I've started to recently think I just can't understand this at all. Because it also seems like we can say something else, which is also controversial, but also really relevant. If another creature can do the same thing it can do, but it also feels, there may be a reason to say why, because it feels it has higher moral status. That is also a very controversial claim. Just because you feel it, you deserve a higher moral standing than the person who doesn't feel it. Yeah, I just at a conference in Ireland, and we were debating this exact point, and several people were writing on this. We're like, wait, because you can now feel it, you get so higher moral status than the thing that can't feel it, even though you're exactly equivalent in every other way. Some people are trying to say, yeah, that's the difference. Feeling is the difference maker. And me and some other people are like, that's starting to sound like a really bad answer, actually. So, yeah, so you wanted something positive. I would say that, on my view, moral standing is grounded in a certain type of computational intelligence that's goal-directed and tied to preferences that allow the system that uses the computational intelligence to have better or worse outcomes for its survival. That's clearly what, and I would say that applies directly to artificial systems, maybe not to large language models now, but it clearly applies to AI. It applies to amoeba and other creatures. It applies to plants. It applies to a whole bunch of things. So that's the grounding property. And then the question is, what are the grading properties, if there are any grading properties that make sense? And it turns out that perhaps, so for some people, it's going to turn out that phenomenal consciousness is different from affective consciousness, and that things that are affectively conscious have higher moral standing than those that have only phenomenal and for other people, it'll be to what degree you're rational, what possesses self, have free will. And then the other component of my theory that's really, really important is the fact that I'm a cluster theorist. So I think that certain capacities can be put together and other capacities automatically go together. So if you have affective consciousness, you have phenomenal consciousness. So you don't ever have just a single, very few things I would say are just computationally intelligent in a goal-directed way that's tied to preferences. They have something else going on. And so the cluster that they have is what I think marks the grade. So the grade is being graded in terms of the cluster of properties they have, not the single one, right? So it's actually, my view is more complicated. It's that there are clusters of capacities that grade moral standing above the simple property of just having computational intelligence that's goal-directed and tied to preferences. Yeah, so now you see a little bit more of the picture. Like, and this is interesting because, for example, you might think that machines can't have emotions, but humans can have emotions. You might think that some creatures have a higher degree of free will than other ones. Okay, so you get the complexity. Yeah.
So it's ringing a bell for me. It reminds me of the work being done by Michael Levin. And are you familiar with his work?
I know his work, but I'm not sure that what I know is what you're referring to.
Okay, so I think
so what does he teach? What does he teach?
So he's
Is he in?
Yes.
In Tufts.
Yes, at Tufts. Are you familiar?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So I've seen him talk twice. Yes, I've seen him talk. I've never met him in person, but I've seen him talk twice. Yes, his account of certain intelligences in the creatures he showed me at one talk is exactly the same as the kind I'm talking about. Right. So that kind of intelligence that he's talking about, I remember I saw two of his talks actually. That is very closely related to, I would say, the other person who's also relevant here is Stephen Wolfram's work on intelligence and computation.
You should actually check. I mean, to grow and work on this because you're coming from a very philosophical background. When you look at his scientific work and you see the things that they're actually doing, it probably strengthens your argument so much more, because I've spoken to him twice. I'm going to speak to him soon as well. He's got a group of guys together and very different views on consciousness as well. I don't know if you know Mark Solms, Chris Fields. There's also Carl Friston. There's this group of thinkers.
I know Carl Friston.
So they're doing a lot of work. They're calling it the field of diverse intelligence. And Mike Levin specifically, he's working on a technological approach to mind everywhere. And he goes towards what you're talking about, this sort of intelligence moving your way and seeing that everything has this level of intelligence, and that does change the way you perceive conscious. It is a sort of panpsychist view in a sense, and he's slowly starting to admit that.
Is it? So the thing is, one of the things I want to remind you about, okay, and then this will lead to a discussion I think you're going to want to engage in. You're going to like this one, because it has to do with your question you asked me about what's the difference between how So remember, panpsychism is about phenomenal consciousness. As soon as you think that way, you can start to have so people say IIT is committed to panpsychism. But what does IIT have to say about phenomenality? It has to talk about integrated information, two notions which can be, measured in phi without there being the right substrate to realize the phenomenality. So just having a debate with one of my friends about this, I was like, there's all this stuff out there right now about whether IIT is a pseudoscience. And I was kind of upset, okay, I think it's a very interesting hypothesis. It's useful and lots of interesting good papers. I have friends that work on it and write good papers, and these people are incredibly smart and saying all these things. And the thing that's being left out of the discussion is that when we distinguish between access and phenomenal consciousness, we can look at both of the leading theories, global workspace theory and IIT, and we can say, well, maybe these theories are just about access consciousness. So to say that maybe these people's work is panpsychist, maybe it's pan-intelligence something or another. At one point in time, I agree. I called my own view something like pan-intelligence, because I wanted to get away from consciousness type terms, and psyche in panpsychism means mental and the roots of the word. So I would be careful about doing that, because one of the things I've noticed repeatedly in looking at the literature and how these people talk is we have lost sensitivity to the difference between access and phenomenal consciousness. The thing, and this is going to touch now on the issue you wanted to hear about, which I'll say now. When Dave Chalmers and Philip Goff and Galen Strawson are talking about cosmopsychism and panpsychism, it's very important to keep in mind that the type of consciousness that they're talking about being explained in fundamental is phenomenal consciousness in this what it's like Hegelian sense. The moment you look at classical Indian philosophy and you see cosmopsychism there, what you're seeing is a structural similarity to a theory that is being promoted in analytic philosophy and has roots in ancient Greek philosophy, but to which I don't know if any of them would understand what I'm talking about when I say phenomenal consciousness. It's not like they would think that the cosmopsychism in pure consciousness of Shankara is like a big blob of unrealized and unowned moments of F sharpness, marinara, curry sauce, blue, red, and all this stuff. It's on a bunch of, first of all, in Shankara, pure consciousness is nirguna, without qualities. It's only in Ramanuja, it's saguna, with qualities. So in the cosmopsychism in Advaita Vedanta, it's impossible that it could have anything to do with phenomenal consciousness.
Completely.
At best.
Yeah, the conversation goes down a completely different road.
It's about, this is the thing that I'm seeing more and more, is that you were right in the beginning. You wanted to say, hey, it's important that people understand and explain this stuff in the right way when they look at this stuff. But one of the things that just stands out over and over again is that you must do some really important work to figure out where you're going to recapture two notions that drive most of Western philosophy of mind after Descartes, which is intentionality and phenomenal consciousness. Because intentionality is actually a little bit easier to find. I just recently reviewed a book by Lorelei Bernanke on Abhinavagupta, the Kashmiri Shaivites' theory of consciousness. And it was interesting how much of her book so carefully and nicely discussed subjective awareness, right? Which is the notion that's more servable in certain Indian texts. But that pure what it's like sort of thing, it's hard. If you read someone like Staneshwar Timilsena's book on theories of consciousness, Advaita Vedanta, I mean, he's also struggling hard to like locate the thing in the textual tradition. So, and you were trying to yourself say you've got to be somewhat, it's easy to misread. So what's easier to misread is not that. It's to have, what it is it's easy to see structural identity independent of the point of the structure and the context of the structure being discussed and what the aim is. Those Vedantic philosophers are very much concerned with this relationship between the individual self and God. The moment you lose sight of that, you will sort of start to see things there that might not really be the best. And then so let me make another clarification here. That's not really always bad. Sometimes you go looking for X and you actually find Y, but Y is actually useful for what you're doing in your own project. So, hey, accidental discoveries that aren't really what people were talking about, if someone says that's not a reason to do cross-traditional philosophy, I'd be like, that's totally wrong. Sometimes you just find good stuff when you're looking for one thing and it's the other thing you found. So there's nothing wrong with that. But it is important to address your main issue that you're raising, that, yeah, be careful, because to me, talking about intelligence the way I want to talk about intelligence has no implications at all for phenomenal consciousness. When I'm talking about this creature that's doing this stuff related to magnetic north in order to track water, I don't want to consider whether or not it's phenomenally conscious as an explanation of its behavior, because I already am aware that it does have the mechanisms. So the evidence probabilistically is going to go my way. It's going to go the way of saying there's far more evidence that it has computational intelligence that's goal-directed, tied to preferential states, than it is going to go for it being phenomenally conscious. At a certain other level of explanation, now we can talk about, what are the markers for phenomenal consciousness in AI, a recent paper that was discussed and put out in Nature and has been making the rounds with everyone. But again, what is that about? It's like about those. I can already say that a large language model is intelligent. And sure, someone could be like, yeah, maybe it's not really intelligent because it doesn't really think. It's all, and then we have the Turing-Searle debate about that. But the evidence is still going to be much higher for saying that it's intelligent than it's phenomenally conscious. So that's why, as a grounding property, I think it's pernicious in a way to not take seriously the idea that we can ground a lot of things as having moral standing without addressing phenomenal consciousness, and we can put that aside for the grading issue. That's a positive view I do have that I've been working on for a couple of years.
I think you're touching on something very fundamental here, and it's the fact that even though I know what you're trying to say and what you're talking about, and I completely understand it, my own ingrainedness in the way I've conceptualized the issue over the years via Western philosophy still allows me to make that slight error of making the assumption that you're still discussing phenomenal consciousness, and that's something that has I'm saying that's what happened when I brought it up earlier. But I completely get what you're saying and how we can make that mistake of still bringing it up, even though that's not really the aspect of consciousness that's being discussed in the Advaita Vedanta and Indian philosophy. It is fundamentally different and not directly talking about phenomenal consciousness. And even though it will have some sort of...
And I think, so let's make that even more clear.
Yes.
I think the evidence will be borne out
Yeah.
that in Advaita Vedanta, whatever is Brahman consciousness, it is not to be identified with phenomenal consciousness or a field of phenomenal consciousness.
Mhm.
My best guess is that that is not what that is supposed to be.
I see.
It does seem to me that there is one important thing that we have to keep into mind, and that's this. It is oftentimes said that the state that one would be in has to do with Satchit Ananda, and Ananda means bliss here. And bliss is a phenomenal property, right? So this leads to this interesting sort of thing where if someone is saying in Shankara's system that Brahman's essential property is bliss, then you're saying two things. You're saying something that has no qualities has a quality. And number two, you're saying something that isn't phenomenal has a phenomenal property, right? So this is a classical sort of problem, both for the argument I gave and also for the argument that that you can understand Shankara's system by talking about something that has no qualities when it has at least two qualities. Okay, so here's the answer to at least one of the problems. You shouldn't understand bliss in Ananda as attributed to Brahman on the model of happiness in a human being. That's the root of the error, basically. So depending on how you read bliss, you could say that in Advaita Vedanta clearly is something like phenomenal consciousness in like a pure form. Like sometimes I like to use the idea of the canvas and the painting on it, right? So the canvas is white, it has a color, right? But that's not really considered quality of the canvas, really, because the canvas is the thing for which other things will go on it, right? So the illusory qualities of experience are superimposed on this pure canvas. Sure, it has a quality, it's bliss, but that isn't really a quality in the same sense because it's the ground upon which the illusory qualities rest and is revealed. So it's just the nature of the thing. That's a way to understand it too. But I would say overall that I don't think, at least in this, now in other traditions like Kashmiri Shaivism, I'm not so sure that there isn't already cropping around between three different words, this thing that can be put together. What is interestingly important is that when Nagel even talks about phenomenal consciousness or the what it's like aspect of experience, you know, there is the talk of subjectivity, there is a talk of awareness, what's it like to be a bat, you know, and so there are those things there. So, but there's this singular notion of phenomenal consciousness that's cut away from everything, harder to find, and probably because, you know, some concepts are what we call network concepts. To talk about that one concept is to imply these other concepts that are networked related to it. Like the concept of color is network related to the concept of a shade, a hue, scarlet versus red. They're networked, and so there's no reason to think phenomenal consciousness isn't networked also. Yeah.
Okay, I think at this point let's get into, I mean, the moral responsibility aspect of understanding this framework. I mean, what type of implications does this have on our understanding of AI, animal intelligence? How can we approach this then differently or better?
Okay, so here things are speculative and they get sometimes a bit too politically charged. So I'm going to stay very close to the things I'm most confident that are implications from what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
So I think at a broad level, one of the things is it changes what we should be looking for when we're trying to think about moral standing. We need to be thinking about goal-directed intelligent behavior, and we need to be thinking about what that goal-directed intelligent behavior means for the survival of the system. Okay, and that cuts across artificial systems and all sorts of plants and animals, right? So that just changes the framework right off the bat by looking at what the orientation is towards it. Now, it turns out that by making that subtle change, there are no immediate policy implications except for one, that the kinds of things that aren't going to get intrinsic moral status, also intrinsic moral value and therefore moral status in a certain way, are things like rocks, for which we cannot understand what it would be to call a rock an intelligent, goal-directed system with preferences. However, other things will get in there, and that will begin to give us a proper understanding of the moral sphere, what falls in the moral sphere. And then, of course, this leads into distinctions about whether or not something has to be alive or living, or what it means to be living in order to be in the moral sphere. Are viruses alive? Are AI alive? I mean, they can exhibit all sorts of intelligent, goal-directed behavior. Some of them nefarious always, other ones can be beneficial. But so it changes that framework. The hard work that has to be done, and I'm actually working on this issue right now, is the question of grading versus digital theories. So a digital theory of moral standing says that once you have any two things have moral status, they have it to the same degree, because it's impossible to conceive of a way to rationally ground moral differences. And the grading view says that X and Y can both have moral status, even though they have differential moral status. Now, unless this technical problem the debate is put to rest in favor of grading, the moral implications from saying that you have a wide net given by intelligent, goal-directed behavior tied to preferences, plus everything that has moral status has the same moral status, leads to an explosion of moral standing. And that is a massively huge shift in our understanding of the nature of morality. So if the non-graded view is the winner under this grounding theory, then the explosion of moral status is extremely high. However, if the other view is correct, then we need to have a very good explanation about why, for example, phenomenal consciousness makes something matter more, and in what sense is there a direct policy implication for it mattering more. Okay, so one distinction that helps here with this is to recognize that there can be a difference between moral standing of something and what is known already as legal standing. Okay, so because morality and legality are not the same thing, it's possible to hold any number of views. So, for example, A and B have the same moral standing, but either A or B has different legal standing. A and B have differential moral standing, but A and B have the same legal standing. And of course, by this, I mean, there's a hidden variable. It's actually something more like A and B have the same moral standing with respect to C, context C, and they have differential legal standing with respect to context C. So because we can draw that distinction, this gives us a nice, rich, textured matrix to give different arguments for why you would want to occupy one of. And this is all work that would take like over, half a decade for several philosophers to work through. Some of it has already been worked through, but and there's some new work coming out right now about degrees of moral status. I'm reviewing a book right now and looking at the arguments and people talking. So it's coming up, but there are these other moves that are related. There's also this sort of thing, which I just said, which is on a lot of people's minds now, where they're like, well, how do I make sense of the fact that when something has phenomenal consciousness, it has more moral status than something it doesn't? And now here's the thing, if phenomenal consciousness is just an illusion. Like, what would make it the case that the illusion makes you have a higher moral standing than something that doesn't? So you can just imagine super intelligent artificial systems in the future for which good arguments have convinced us that the kind of thing that they're housed in cannot give realization to phenomenal consciousness. It only gives realization to access consciousness through artificial general intelligence. Suppose that's true. All of a sudden, you're going to tell me, because you've got some funky illusion going on inside of you, given to you by years, generations, whatever, of evolution, that now there could be good reason to have that argument and say yes, but that's starting to sound a little bit weird. It definitely would write in a nice little book to explain that argument. So I assume that maybe some of the people who are in the illusionist, surrealist, hyper-realist, hyper-illusion view are probably thinking about this, because it seems to me obviously an issue. Also, if you have something like the view that says pain can be felt, but it can also be unconscious. So, for example, pains can be unconscious. Then you might think, well, why does the thing that feels the pain matter more than the thing that just has a bunch of unconscious pains, right? Has to do with what philosophical theory of pain you have. But there are people who argue that you can have unconscious pains. And then why does becoming aware of the pain, why does the feeling of suffering matter more than the suffering? This is kind of like what I'm also saying. Like, we can clearly say that the system that is in an oxygen low environment is suffering and not doing as well as it could be than if it was in an oxygen rich environment. It doesn't matter if it feels it. I mean, it's objectively true of the system. As long as we hold constant that surviving is better than not surviving, in many cases, it will be true that because it's not going to continue to survive in this environment, it is better off in the other environment. It doesn't have to feel it to get it. So I think that's sort of like the broad things. Now, if you want to say and ask me something more specific about what comes from this kind of framework, I would hesitate to think it's good to mention anything else because people like to sometimes over politicize things. And at this stage, I don't think this is a very politically savvy. Yeah, it's more like technical things we have to work out.
And I think there's still so much, there's so much more room for improvement from your, and I'm pretty sure you feel that way, where you can still fine tune this a lot more, and there's no point in reading.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
I think another thing that might play a big role, I mean, we're looking at these intelligent agents at some point. I mean, at what point do we consider things like volition and freedom of the will to adjust and change that moral standing and behavior?
That's right. So I think it's a grading property. So on my view, as of now, free will is a grading property. And in addition, the way I think about it is that there are degrees of freedom itself. So grading is going to be relativized to degrees of freedom. So one of the things that comes up in the discussion is the relationship between free will as it's understood in the case of humans and how it's understood in the case of artificial systems, right? So there is a relationship between the programming of an artificial system and what kind of behavior can be an output of it. And there is something going on in the human case where we talk about us as having free will. And those issues about free will have to be at least coherently understood in a way that there's a framework for attributing free will across the two things in a way that makes sense. Otherwise, there's no grading to talk about if what we mean by free will in the human case is so drastically different than free will star in the AI case, some other concept that's different. So yes, it does seem to be important. But again, one of the top first things you asked me about is what's the definition of the self? And one of them I gave you was the principal actor notion versus, and I said the principal actor notion and the true self can be understood in different ways related to the free will problem. So, what does it mean to say that an artificial system has a self? What does that really amount to in terms of its free will and stuff like this? Mm-hmm. And I think that those questions are definitely they're much further out because the framework that can address them has to settle one of the hardest debates in all of philosophy. Have you ever heard of Hume's fork?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's two versions of Hume's fork. I'm going to do the one about free will. So either the thing, system, whatever is determined or not. If it's determined, well, it's determined. If it's not determined, though, we still have a problem. And that's how does that non-determined thing get to the thing that is the action, the agent causation relation. So it's like either. So it's a hard problem. I mean, there are a lot of smart people working on this. And now to touch back to your larger point from the beginning, it's also clear that it has a lot of ramifications across cultures. Because free will is conceived very differently in the Islamic traditions, conceived differently in certain Indian traditions, very different in Christianity, can be argued to be the theodicies of Christian philosophy in terms of God's divine properties of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipotence in relationship to the problem of free will are understood in one way. So there's different ramifications there too, and that's the thing.
Tell me, Anand, it seems that overall, I mean, the overarching theme here, and I think with Indian philosophy in general is that non-dualism, that non-duality of mind, let's say. But have you ever considered that non-dual aspect to be ideal, like an idealist perspective? Have you ever thought of it maybe from the consciousness is all there is and reality?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
So first clarification, I would hesitate to be like non-dualism is a big idea.
Yeah, to generalize it that way. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I think it's also not that I think it's present in a lot of Western philosophy. It's just that I think it's present in Chinese philosophy.
Oh, yes, true.
I don't know. I think if you go the other direction, you're going to find that there could be this notion floating around there in other things. Yeah. So one of the things that is interesting to me is this thing that David Chalmers discusses in Reality Plus, his new book, which he also discussed a long time ago at a conference in Germany, right around the time he was working on a paper called The Matrix of Metaphysics. And sometimes it can be talked about in contemporary information theory or sort of physics through the work of John Wheeler with the idea it from bit. So I don't know. I mean, that's difficult. That's like the free will problem. Like, I guess I'm a bedrock substance realist in some ways. Like, I don't think it comes from bit without coming from bit. But Dave discusses this in his book and says it's an it-bit thing all the way down. There doesn't have to be a fundamental level that's bits at the bottom. It's at the bottom. Yeah. So I definitely think this is a difficult one, and I think some of it has to do with this. It's actually a problem that occurred in a lot of the modern period of philosophy with people like Locke and Berkeley and Robert Boyle and Bale, and so this thing about what is a sensation of pressure and force that we feel, there's this thing. So the question was, what is solidity, basically? So if there's an it from bit problem, it's related to me to this issue of solidity that was so heavily debated at this time period. It also turns out to be the case in direct relationship to this that people like Sri Ramakrishna and Galen Strawson and Michael Lockwood have all argued that the problem of consciousness is not the most important problem right now. It's the problem of materiality. Because materiality is related to the notion of solidity. For most humans, that's the connection. Like, what is material are solid bodies. Even though we now know that phases of water, such as vapor, are material too. That's not where our hardcore notion is tied into. It's tied into materiality. So Strawson wrote in the New York Times a paper where he argued, this is actually the hardest thing to explain. I agree that this actually is indirectly related to thinking about consciousness and even what makes sense it makes to talk about it from bit, insofar as bit is an abstract information relationship that's can be mathematically defined and stuff like this. So yeah, there's something there. Ramakrishna also made this point. Michael Lockwood made this point. Several Indian philosophers have been like, yeah, consciousness being fundamental, hey, you're conscious. Just imagine everything else is fundamentally that way. At least you got evidence for it. How do you explain this material thing that's going on? That's the odd thing out there. Now, whether or not that's idealist is again a thing that is, I think, somewhat to be careful about also. And this is like, most people don't really care about this stuff because it's about picking about the right way to describe things in the words that are commonly used. But consciousness only doesn't lead me to the conclusion that it's an idealist view as opposed to a realist view. What it leads me to is a question about asymmetric relations such that what is real can ground something that is less real or unreal. And this is precisely what Shankara and Ramanuja are debating, right? So one of them can oftentimes be read, Shankara, as sort of like a relative realist or an illusionist, where everything other than pure consciousness, which is Brahman, is less real or illusory, and where Ramanuja is being like, no, that doesn't make any sense. Like, they're just real in a different sense or in a different way, but they're equally real. And so they're worrying about that realist relation versus idealist. I think even Berkeley, to a certain degree, we use the word idealist there somewhat differently than what we mean when we talk about like the Yogacara school of Buddhism, which is what you're kind of, all this is consciousness only, right? Type of sort of statement. I think that's in Vasubandhu, actually, if I'm correct. But yeah, it's I think there's something there. I personally am a strong form of I'm a realist for sure, and the schools of Indian philosophy I like are Ramanuja and Gangesha's Navaya Nyaya because they're realists in a sense that I identify with. I don't find much leaning towards illusionism, idealism, and things like that. What I think is the truth in all of those things is that there are clearly illusions present in our life. What I can't take seriously is anything that comes close to global illusionism or self-undermining illusionism. So it would be weird to be a realist and not think that illusions are present everywhere all the time, most of the time, or something like that. But it would be really weird to not think that what is the best explanation for those illusions is that there are things that aren't illusions. Yeah, that's sort of the difference between me and some of the proponents of Buddhism, is that I'm more inclined towards a view that says that somewhere in there's something that's not an illusion, which explains illusoriness for a subject. Also, the other thing to remember here is that as we understand that our illusions, like if you're having an illusion, I might not be having an illusion. Something's got to explain that. I guess I can't understand why there's all illusions everywhere. It's not understanding that. Then who's having the illusion? An illusion? An illusion. So this is what they tell me. We have these debates, and I just get logged like, oh, it's an illusion having an illusion. Okay. Can't someone in a dream have another dream? Can't there be dreams embedded in a dream? Can't the movie Inception make perfect sense? Yeah, but didn't the movie Inception only make sense because actually there was one level at which there wasn't a dream? I mean, wasn't that why the movie did make sense? Otherwise, what was going on? So this that goes back to this to what we called foundational illusionism. So foundational illusionism is that the claim that it can be illusions all the way down, right? And so one of the things I have a problem with is also foundational illusionism.
If you had to sort of give well, me even because I'm very curious. I mean, there was a time where as growing up where I read a lot of Indian philosophy, and then in school from once you enter school, and Western schools and universities, it sort of seems to me at least to have been ingrained out of me. And at this time of my life, I find myself sort of drawn back to it. If for someone like me or anyone who's curious out there, what would you recommend in terms of Indian philosophy, reading for understanding the nature of mind, reality? What are some of the best philosophy?
Okay, so one of the things I'll say is that now, as opposed to like when you're really young, it's really easy actually. It's not hard, and in fact, there already are lists out there of books. I can send you a link, or I think it's on Brian Van Norden's website, where he has a whole list just for Indian philosophy, where he has a reading list of things that people can read that are accessible and stuff like that. And I think it's about also the level of depth you want to get into. Like some of the stuff I read is really technical and in the weeds, and most people just, even if they're interested in Indian philosophy, would not really want to wade through all of that, because it's at another level and it's about something else. There are a lot of popular explanations of things. I mean, some of the writers that I read and enjoy the most are people like Bimal Krishna Matilal. I think he's a great person. And Jitendra Mohanty, who just passed away. Arindam Chakrabarti, Purushottama Bilamoria, Mark Sideritz, Jay Garfield, Moni Machada, Janardhan Ganeri, Stephen Phillips. These are all friends of mine who I read. I think they write totally accessible things. But it also is about popularity to a certain degree. What kind of, you could read someone like Amita Chatterjee talking about cognitive science and Indian philosophy and read a really interesting paper, but I'm not sure it'd be as accessible as reading a popular work that presents, like Lorelei Bernanke's book on Abhinavagupta, which presents sort of like an accessible, popular engaged scholarly sort of engagement with other things. So it depends kind of like what you're looking for and going. One of the books that I taught in my class is Waking Dreaming Being by Evan Thompson. Excellent read. And actually many of the kids in the class had no experience with philosophy, and they just thought it was a wonderful book to read. They just loved it, thought it was great. It's mostly about Buddhism and neuroscience. There's a lot of stuff in that area on Buddhism and neuroscience that are really good. There's a very recent book that came out by Jay Garfield and Nalini Bhushan, where they collected together, I think, over 20 papers from the history of 20th century Indian philosophy by writers like K.C. Bhattacharya, A.C. Mukherjee, all these people that are not really well known, that are really great people in the early part of the 20th century, forming a new sort of period in Indian philosophy that's not often discussed, and very interesting period. And it's also important to recognize that there's like this tendency in studying Indian philosophy that goes multiple ways, but at least one is that there are people who are very interested in the purity of the Sanskrit language. So what they're interested in doing is learning how to read and write, read mostly, not write, but it involves writing also, read and write Sanskrit so that they can read the texts and also engage in chanting practices. So for them, it's the whole process of engaging with Indian philosophy is that reading it in Sanskrit and chanting it is a very spiritual exercise. And so for them, the whole dimension is based in the practice of doing those two things. Then there are other people who want to read Sanskrit because they just want to be able to read the original text for the stuff they're working on and translating and trying to explain. And then there are other people who want to read Indian philosophers who write in English, and write in pretty, like, one of the things I'll tell you is that it's not a joke at all. It's just if you read Radhakrishnan's work, his popular books on Indian philosophy, like Science and Spirituality is a short one that you might like, the writing is so good. Like the writing, the prose in English is just, it's top. It's like really well written. Like, I mean, his ability to write was just really good. And like, it's no joke. Like the prose, it's just paragraphs are excellent. Just so, in a completely different way, Krishnamurti, also a great writer, a lot more spiritual than Radhakrishnan, but a lot easy to read. I think those are all, there's a lot of stuff out there. So I would say basically what it is that you need to sample two things. What is the level you're looking for? What is the purity you're looking for? And what is it in topics that you want to get out of it? So in terms of level, on any one of these topics, I can take you to some super scholarly article all the way up to a popular explanation. In terms of engagement, I can take you to someone who, purity, someone who's, is all going to be in Sanskrit, and that's it. Or someone who's going to talk in the language of cognitive neuroscience, Sanskrit, English, contemporary Western philosophy, classical Indian philosophy in English. It translated into English, mix of all that. And then in terms of areas, it can be anything from ethics and political life to ahimsa and veganism, all the way down to, states of consciousness and the 54 different versions of states of consciousness in the Abhidharma Kosha, the Abhidharma school of Buddhism. So there's a lot of stuff like that you can get access to. And I think the only way to do it as a novice is really just to be honest about trying things out and seeing where they go. I think one book that I read early on was not a popular book. It was a short book. And because I had some philosophical training, it was helpful. It was An Introduction to Classical Indian Philosophy by Jitendra Mohanty, I think published in the 80s. And I thought it was really good. I thought it was, it was unlike the other things I had read before that only seemed to me to be discussing aspects of spirituality. Not that that wasn't important, but it seemed to be, here are some, these are some core ideas about what is knowledge, what is consciousness, what is reasoning, what do these terms mean in these classical Indian schools. And then from there, over the time, I eventually got to other things. Probably the most favorite read I've ever had is Perception, an essay in Classical Indian Ways of Knowing by Bimal Krishna Motilal. I think it's probably the most influential book in Indian philosophy on my current thinking. So yeah.
I'm definitely going to look into this, because I mean that's the purpose of this podcast as a whole. Is this just this curiosity about all of this field, no matter whether you're looking at it from the west or the east. It's just very fascinating overall. And I think when you are a novice and you're trying to start out and read through it, you have to have some sort of a basic understanding at least, because it gets quite tough. And a big concern for me was translations, and I think you already addressed that, because I get concerned sometimes when you're trying to read something else.
It's not gonna go away. I mean, these translation issues are difficult. There are some well-established. So what is going on in Western philosophy that isn't always the case with Indian philosophy is that not only are there established translations of Descartes, for example, okay, or Aristotle, but there's also pretty well-established rudimentary explanations. So like I've been teaching Descartes for years. I read them in English, not in Latin or French. And basically, yeah, I mean, I know that when I tell my students something about Descartes' theory, that it's kind of a lie. It's a little bit of an illusion. But I also know the trajectory to reveal the illusion as we're sort of learning more and more and getting deeper into what Descartes could be talking about, right? Is he even really a dualist at all? I mean, we could like get really deep in there, contradicting very straightforward claims in the book. But in Indian philosophy, I think there are, in some cases, established translations, but are there established core, easy ways of explaining it? Okay, if you go to some places in India, they'll say yes. You always read, so I was just at a reading group, and we think what it was. Oh, you read in Vedanta, and you're studying epistemology, the Vedanta Paribhasha by Dharmaraja. You read this book. It's a very short book, but it's a very good, very core ideas about epistemology in Vedanta. You read the Tarkam Samgraha by Anand Vaidya when you're studying Nyaya. I believe that's the text that people. So there are texts like this that are established, but is there an established, like, here's a story you tell in this book, and then you really, like, I don't know. Because I've never trained with those people, so I can't speak to that issue. They just told me go read that, they want to read it. But there might be in certain Sanskrit medium schools where Sanskrit debates are going on and stuff like that. But for a modern person who doesn't really read Sanskrit and wants to learn in English, there definitely are texts that are explained nicely by people, or at least, and this is the crucial thing, they're explained in the way where knowing it and understanding is clearly useful. So one example I can give that I think is very valuable is Mark Sideritz wrote a really nice kind of introductory book, Buddhism as Philosophy. They re-released it recently with a shorter version of it. That book, whatever you think about the core tenets of Buddhism, I would say is just really good if you've never really got into anything that was technical about Buddhism and you wanted to read something that was technical enough, but really actually got you further into understanding and gave you an orientation that you could navigate from it. Absolutely. Yeah. I would say, yeah. So it doesn't have to be the end all be all. You can read Stephen Phillips and Matthew Dosty's translation with commentaries of the Nyaya Sutra from Gautama Vatsayana and Udyatakara. They've got the original text there plus explanations. Outstanding book, no problem. You should be fine. So I think there are things like that. I think if you look at the Brian Van Norden website where he has the complete reading list for introductory sort of like learning things across various traditions, you'll find, actually, now that I just remembered, I don't know why I'm always talking about other people. If you go to my website and you go to my class called Classical Indian Philosophy, I also have categorized, just in the case of Classical Indian Philosophy, about 30 papers and 18 resources. I don't know why I'm mentioning Brian's work only. I already did this myself. I did this long before he had that list.
That's perfect, because now I can at least I'll put a link to that directly as well.
Yeah, but I will say this. My list is very much like, these are the scholarly articles that I would actually teach someone, because this is going to bring you up to speed about these kinds. But there are papers in there about, Sankhya theories of consciousness. There are papers about, the nature of inference and Nyaya. There's papers in there about perception by me and Matthew Dosty. Yeah. So it's a link to that. It's under my courses. It's called Classical Indian Philosophy.
This has been such an intriguing conversation as a whole. Anand, anything from your side that you feel that you want to mention or pinpoint?
I think as a closing statement, one of the things I think that's speaks to like how I approach things, and I think reflects something about what you yourself want, is like, Curiosity is helpful here. It's not something to be like, get rid of it, or like something like it kills the cat or something like that. I think I think V.N. Jha said this to me one time. He said, if you're curious about Indian philosophy, you're going to find more than 18 lifetimes worth of stuff to read that you'll enjoy. There's so much out there. He told me this. I was at one of his reading groups. I had to get up at like 4:30 in the morning to catch him at 6:30 in the morning in India or something like that, and 6:30 in the evening. And he said, and he was just like, yeah, he was trying to tell all these students in India who really aren't scholars. Like I was one of the few like scholars that would come to his courses. A lot of them are just, people who are in like their 60s, retired, and want to learn Indian philosophy. And he's just like, there's just so many great, debates. And we read the Tattva Bodha by Shankara, and he gave this wonderfully lucid explanation of it, and then followed it up by Jayanta Bhatta's critique of the Tattva Bodha in one of his texts. And I was just like, oh my God, this is just like so fun. It's like, I mean, if you studied philosophy and you liked reading Locke and Berkeley debate one another, which is it's fun. It's super fun, actually. I just don't teach that stuff. It's fun. It's just great to talk about, like, the Buddhists and the Nyaya squaring off about the nature of the true self. And yeah, it's a form of enjoyment and curiosity. If you're not a professional philosopher like me, who actually has to do like hard laborious work every day figuring this out, you can just enjoy it and stuff like that, and not come home crying and pulling your hair out. So my word is to people is like, enjoy the curiosity of exploring it. And I really value the time we had together, Tevin. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anand. It's such a pleasure. I can't wait to rewatch this and actually listen to everything, get all the names down, and actually make a list for myself as well. It takes multiple listenings for myself, and I know the viewers and the listeners also enjoy doing that. So I'm looking forward to them seeing it as well.
All right. Thank you very much for the conversation.